Ever wonder how the ancient Egyptians built those colossal pyramids and managed to hold together one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history? We tend to imagine pharaohs giving commands from golden thrones, or armies of laborers working beneath the blazing sun. But the truth is far more subtle and far more fascinating. Behind the great monuments and the sweeping river stood an invisible army. Scribes with ink-stained hands, officials who knew every grain of wheat in a village storehouse, and governors who could organize thousands without raising their voices. Tonight, we step into their world, into the quiet but powerful machine that kept Egypt alive for thousands of years. Before you settle in, if you enjoy these tales, consider liking the video and drop a comment below. Where are you listening from, and what's the time where you are? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us across the globe. Now, dim your screens, get comfortable, and let's drift into history together. Now, let's step into the long, golden shadows of the Nile, into an Egypt that is not just temples and tombs, but a living organism of people, paper, and planning. We will wander through halls where papyrus scrolls are stacked higher than a man, where the scratch of a reed pen carries the weight of a royal decree, and where the soft murmurs of record keepers echo like the heartbeat of a nation. We'll see how this system, this intricate network of roles and responsibilities, allowed an empire to survive famine, flood, and foreign invasion, and how its lessons still echo in our modern world. Imagine the Nile Valley around 5,000 years ago. The sun rises slowly over the eastern horizon, turning the river's surface into molten gold. Along its banks, reeds sway gently in the morning breeze. You hear the distant cry of waterbirds as they skim the surface, and the rhythmic creak of wooden shadoofs lifting water from the river to nearby fields. The land is rich, but life is fragile. Villages dot the banks, each with its own small plots of barley and emmer wheat. Children chase each other in the dust between mud brick homes. Women kneel by the river's edge, washing linen and laying it out to dry on smooth, warm stones. Men wade into the shallows with woven baskets, scooping up tilapia and catfish for the day's meal. This is Egypt before the pharaohs, a patchwork of independent communities, each with its own rhythms and customs. But the river is both a blessing and a challenge. Its annual flood brings life-giving silt, yet its timing and height are unpredictable. Too little water, and the fields will yield a poor harvest. Too much, and entire homes can be swept away. In the earliest days, each village handles these challenges alone. They store what grain they can in clay jars. They dig small irrigation ditches to bring water to the fields. But the river is not a thing that respects boundaries. A poorly maintained canal in one village can flood the next. A shortage upstream means hunger downstream. Slowly, the realization spreads. Survival is not just about farming well. It is about organizing together. You can almost picture the first meetings. Elders from several villages gathering under the shade of a sycamore tree. They sit cross-legged on woven mats, speaking slowly, weighing words carefully. One suggests keeping track of when the river rises and falls. Another proposes storing surplus grain in a shared granary so no single village suffers in a bad year. At first, these agreements are informal, remembered by those present. But memory fades, and disputes arise. And so, one man is chosen to remember, not in his head, but in marks pressed into wet clay. His hands are calloused from farm work, but his mind is sharp. He becomes the first recorder, the ancestor of the Egyptian scribe. This is not yet a formal office, but it is the seed. As the years pass, these meetings grow more structured. A man skilled at keeping time with the river might be tasked with organizing the clearing of canals. Another, respected for his fairness, may be asked to settle disputes over grazing land. In some villages, a leader emerges who coordinates planting times, ensures tools are repaired, and arranges labor for large tasks. And soon, a pattern takes shape. Certain people do not farm or fish, not full-time. Their role is to manage, to remember, to plan. They are paid in grain from the community storehouses, for their work is as vital as the sowing and reaping. When larger leaders, proto-kings, rise in Upper and Lower Egypt, they find these systems already in place. The elders and recorders are folded into a wider network. Grain tallies from a single village are now sent to a regional overseer. Water measurements from multiple settlements are compiled to predict the coming flood's impact. The tools evolve too. Clay tablets give way to papyrus scrolls, lighter to carry and easier to store. The reed pen replaces the stick, and ink made from soot and gum flows across the page. Records now travel not just by word of mouth, but by boat, carried along the Nile to central storehouses and administrative centers. And here is where the magic happens. The small, local agreements of a single village transform into a web of communication that stretches for hundreds of miles. A shortage of grain in one region can be supplied from another. Repairs to a canal are scheduled weeks in advance, with teams dispatched from multiple villages to work together. It is easy to imagine the pride of an early scribe, unrolling a scroll and seeing the careful rows of symbols, each a record of work done, grain stored, people fed. He is no warrior, yet he holds power. With a single number misplaced, a village might go hungry. With one clever adjustment, hundreds may thrive. And so, from the simple needs of survival, food, water, fairness, grows a structure that will, in time, be as enduring as the stones of the pyramids. The bureaucracy of Egypt does not begin with royal decrees carved into temple walls. It begins here, in the quiet, steady work of people who understood that to tame the river, one must first organize the people who live beside it. Picture a tall, stepped pyramid, not of stone, but of people. At its shining peak, a single figure sits on a gilded throne, the Pharaoh. Below him, tier upon tier, stand the men, and sometimes women, who translate his will into the daily life of the nation. If you were to enter this living pyramid, you would not begin at the top. You would start at its vast, broad base, where life hums with the small sounds of administration. The scratch of reed pens, the shuffling of papyrus scrolls, the murmur of voices reading tallies aloud. But to truly understand it, we must climb slowly, level by level. At the very summit stands the Pharaoh, not merely a king, but the embodiment of Horus on earth, the divine link between gods and men. His word is law, but his role is not to micromanage. In truth, the Pharaoh's greatest power lies in delegation. You might imagine him receiving reports while seated in a shaded open-air hall, columns painted with bright scenes of the gods. Couriers arrive by boat, carrying scrolls from across Egypt. Some are opened immediately. Others are handed to trusted aides. The Pharaoh decides matters of state, a new temple to be built, a tax to be adjusted, a foreign trade agreement to be pursued. But he does not decide how many workers will be needed to repair a canal in a distant nome, nor does he tally grain jars in local storehouses. That is the work of the viziers, the men just below him. They are the highest official in the land after the Pharaoh, a figure of enormous authority, often chosen for loyalty and wisdom rather than sheer birthright. Some viziers were royal relatives, others were elevated from the ranks of trusted scribes. The vizier is the bridge between the pharaoh's vision and the daily work of the kingdom. In modern terms, he is equal parts prime minister, chief justice, and head of civil service. His responsibilities are vast, overseeing all other officials, from governors to tax collectors, presiding over the highest court in the land, supervising large-scale building projects, managing the royal treasury. Imagine the vizier's day beginning at dawn. His home is not a palace, but it is large, its walls painted with scenes of orderly processions. By mid-morning, his courtyard is full, scribes reading reports aloud, messengers waiting for orders, overseers discussing harvest predictions. The vizier listens, asks questions, and issues instructions that ripple outward like the Nile's floodwaters, touching every corner of the kingdom. Below the vizier are the nomarchs, the governors of Egypt's provinces, known as nomes. Each nome has its own distinct personality, shaped by geography. A northern nome near the delta might thrive on fishing and papyrus harvesting. A southern one might depend on stone quarries or gold mines. The nomarch's role is to keep his province running smoothly, balancing local needs with the demands of the central government. He collects taxes, usually in the form of grain, cattle, or labor, and ensures they are transported to royal storehouses. He supervises irrigation work, resolves disputes, and enforces laws. A good nomarch is a diplomat as well as a manager. He must keep the local farmers and traders content, while also meeting the quotas set by the vizier for them. If the flood is poor, he must decide whether to tighten rations, petition for relief, or quietly draw from hidden reserves. In times of stability, the nomarch is a loyal servant of the pharaoh. But in weaker periods, history shows us that some nomarchs grew powerful enough to act independently, a reminder that this pyramid of power was always a careful balance. Beneath the nomarchs are the overseers, each responsible for a specific domain. Overseer of fields are responsible for tracking crops, predicting yields, and organizing planting. Overseer of granaries are responsible for maintaining storehouses, monitoring spoilage, and controlling distribution. Overseer of temples are responsible for ensuring that religious sites remain supplied and staffed. Overseers are practical people. They spend as much time outdoors as they do in offices. You might see an overseer of works standing barefoot on a construction site, shouting instructions to workers hauling limestone blocks, then sitting down hours later to sign off on a scribe's carefully written log. While scribes technically sit near the lower rungs of this hierarchy, their influence is immense. Without them, nothing could be recorded, stored, or communicated. Every measurement, every tax, every legal judgment, all pass through a scribe's hand. A scribe might work for the vizier, a nomarch, or an overseer. His days are long and meticulous. The reed pen must be cut just right. The ink must be the perfect thickness. A blot of ink in the wrong place could alter a number and cause a shipment of grain to be misdirected. Many scribes begin their careers in temple schools, memorizing thousands of hieroglyphs, learning mathematics for calculations, and practicing neat handwriting until their fingers ache. They are trained not only in writing, but in discretion, for the documents they handle are the lifeblood of the kingdom. The genius of the Egyptian bureaucracy lies in the way information moves. Orders flow downward, from Pharaoh to Vizier, from Vizier to Nomarchs, from Nomarchs to overseers, and finally to the workers and farmers. But equally important is the flow upward. Local scribes record crop yields, which overseers send to nomarchs, who compile them into provincial reports for the vizier. By the time the pharaoh sees the numbers, they have been checked and rechecked, ensuring he governs from a position of informed strength. This two-way flow keeps the vast kingdom connected. A farmer in a small village may never meet the pharaoh, but his harvest will be counted, taxed, and recorded in the same system that funds the building of temples hundreds of miles away. It's tempting to see this hierarchy as a static structure, but in reality, it breathes and shifts like the Nile. In times of plenty, the system hums along, delivering surplus grain to storehouses and funding monumental works. In times of crisis, it strains but adapts. Officials reroute resources, change labor assignments, and petition for help from other regions. The pharaoh may be the visible face of Egypt's power, but it is this human pyramid, from viziers to overseers to scribes, that keeps the country standing. Without them, orders would vanish into the desert air, and the great monuments would never have risen from the sand. If the pharaoh was the heart of ancient Egypt and the vizier the guiding mind, then the scribes were its nervous system, carrying messages, recording memories, and ensuring that every limb of the state knew what the others were doing. Yet in this land, where stone monuments rise toward the sky, the most enduring power was not chiseled in granite, but brushed in black ink on papyrus. Before the sun has fully risen over the Nile, a young man sits cross-legged in a shaded courtyard, his writing kit laid neatly before him. In a small wooden case are his reed pens, each carefully cut to a fine point, and small cakes of black and red ink. Beside them rests a roll of fresh papyrus, its surface smooth but faintly fibrous under the fingertips. His training began years ago in the House of Life, the temple school. There, he learned to hold his pen at the correct angle, to make the flowing curves of hieratic script, and to commit to memory hundreds of signs and symbols. His lessons were not only in writing, but in mathematics, geometry, and even law. For a scribe might one day record anything from tax receipts to legal judgments. It is meticulous work. A single smudge can ruin a page. The ink must be neither too wet nor too dry. The pen must be cut just so. Mistakes are not simply erased. They are scraped away carefully, for papyrus is precious, and wasting it is costly. A scribe's day might be spent copying temple inventories, recording the output of a granary, or taking testimony in a land dispute. He works in the shade when possible, but sometimes the job requires standing in a sunlit field, jotting numbers as overseers measure grain or cattle. And unlike the grandeur of the pharaoh's decrees, much of this writing will never be read by the public. These are the backstage notes of a civilization, essential but invisible. It is impossible to separate the story of Egyptian bureaucracy from the story of taxes. In a world without coinage for much of its history, taxes were paid in kind: sacks of barley, jars of beer, baskets of onions, flocks of geese. Twice a year, tax assessors traveled the length of the Nile, measuring the output of each farm. They carried measuring ropes for fields, scales for weighing grain, and ledgers for recording every detail. A farmer might see them coming from a distance, their reed pens tapping on the sides of their cases. The process was deliberate. First, the land's area was measured. Then, the yield was estimated based on the fertility of the soil and the height of the flood that year. From these figures, a tax was calculated, usually a fixed percentage of the harvest. Payment was taken on the spot or scheduled for after the harvest. Grain was stored in local granaries before being transported, often by boat, to regional storehouses or directly to the state's reserves. The records of these transactions were not idle lists. They were the backbone of state planning. If a province's yield was low, the vizier needed to know immediately so that reserves could be shifted. If a surplus was recorded, it could be earmarked for temple offerings or public works projects. The granary was the true treasure vault of Egypt, built from mud brick, often with thick, rounded walls to keep out pests and heat. These structures could store vast quantities of grain. Inside, workers poured grain through chutes into bins, where it was kept dry until needed. The smell of stored wheat was warm and earthy, and the air inside the granary was cool compared to the sunlit courtyard outside. Grain clerks kept tallies with care. Each sack received was noted, and each sack withdrawn, whether to feed workers on a temple site or to be shipped downriver, was recorded in duplicate. One copy stayed with the local overseer. Another was sent up the chain to the central administration. In this way, the movement of grain could be tracked across the entire kingdom. A scribe in Thebes could know, within weeks, how much grain had been collected in a delta town hundreds of miles away. It is easy to imagine temples only as places of worship, incense curling upward before statues of the gods, chants echoing through painted halls. But in Egypt, temples were also vast economic hubs, integrated deeply into the bureaucratic network. A temple owned land, employed workers, and managed large herds and flocks. It received offerings not only in symbolic goods, like flowers or incense, but in tangible resources, grain, oil, honey, cloth. Priests, in their white linen robes, oversaw rituals, but they also oversaw accounts. Scribes working for the temple kept ledgers of temple property, payments to workers, and trades made with merchants. Temples could store surplus grain in their own granaries, loaning it out in hard years, often at interest. In times of famine, temples might distribute food to the poor, an act of piety, but also one that reinforced the temple's role as a stabilizing force in society. The line between state administration and religious authority was never sharp in Egypt. The pharaoh was seen as a divine figure, and many high-ranking officials also held priestly titles. This meant that the flow of taxes and the flow of offerings often moved through the same channels. For example, a portion of grain collected as tax might be allocated to a temple to fund festivals, feed the priesthood, or maintain sacred buildings. Likewise, temples could be tasked with storing state grain reserves. This intertwining ensured that religion and bureaucracy reinforced each other. The gods received their due, the people received the benefits of organized administration, and the pharaoh's authority was affirmed at every level. Egyptian bureaucracy worked in rhythm with the Nile's 3 seasons, Akit, the flood season, when the river swelled and fields lay underwater. This was the time for repairs, planning, and redistribution of stored food. Pare, the growing season, when sowing and tending of crops took place, with overseers and scribes making regular inspections. Shemu, the harvest season, when taxes were collected, granaries filled, and detailed records compiled for the year. Each season brought its own pace of work. In Akit, officials might be found inspecting canal walls; in Pare, measuring young crops; in Shemu, overseeing the weighing of barley and wheat. In the quiet hours of the evening, a scribe might sit in the glow of an oil lamp, unrolling the day's work, tallies from a granary, notes from a temple ledger, or a decree from a nomarch. His reed pen scratches softly against the papyrus. Outside, the night insects hum, and somewhere far away, the Nile slides silently through the dark. It is work that is never truly finished. Tomorrow will bring more numbers to record, more disputes to document, more grain to measure. And yet, it is this endless, careful work that keeps Egypt whole. From the humblest village to the grandest temple, from the lowliest scribe to the Pharaoh himself, all are bound together in the same great machine, the daily grind of bureaucracy, as essential to Egypt's greatness as the river that nourished it. When we think of ancient justice, it's easy to picture something swift and brutal, a guard's hand on a sword, a public punishment in the marketplace. But in Egypt, justice was not meant to be ruled by passion or chance. It was meant to reflect Mat, the concept of truth, balance, and cosmic order. In the eyes of the Egyptians, Mat was not just a virtue, it was a force that held the universe together. To disturb it was to invite chaos, and to preserve it was the duty of all, from the pharaoh down to the humblest farmer. And so, justice in ancient Egypt was woven directly into the fabric of its bureaucracy. At the summit, as always, was the pharaoh, the ultimate judge in theory. His word could overturn any verdict, grant pardons, or impose punishments. But in practice, very few cases ever reached him. Most were handled at lower levels by a carefully tiered legal system. The vizier acted as chief judge of the land, presiding over the high court in the capital. This court dealt with the most serious cases, disputes between provinces, accusations involving high officials, or matters that touched on royal property and temples. Below the vizier's court were provincial courts, overseen by nomarchs or appointed judges. These courts heard cases involving land boundaries, debts, theft, and local disputes. Even smaller still were village councils, often composed of elders who knew both the land and the people intimately. This hierarchy ensured that most disputes were settled close to home, but with the possibility of appeal to higher authorities if needed. Picture a courtroom in ancient Thebes. It is not a stone chamber with towering walls, but an open-sided hall within an administrative building. Sunlight filters through reed mats hung from the roof beams, and the air smells faintly of papyrus and dust. At one end, the judge, perhaps a senior official, sits on a low wooden chair. Beside him, a scribe unrolls a scroll to record every word. The plaintiff and defendant stand facing the judge, speaking slowly, their voices low and respectful. There are no lawyers. Each person speaks for themselves, though sometimes witnesses are called to support a claim. Evidence might be as simple as a marked boundary stone, a measuring rope, or a written receipt from years past. The judge listens, asks questions, and confers quietly with 2 or 3 other officials seated nearby. When the decision is given, it is clear, concise, and rooted in mat. The scribe writes it down, the disputing parties bow, and the matter is closed. Egyptian law favored restitution over destruction. Theft might be punished not only by returning the stolen goods, but by paying an additional fine. Damage to irrigation channels could require the offender to repair them at their own expense. For serious crimes, such as murder, treason, or temple robbery, punishments could be severe, including forced labor, exile, or execution. But these were rare, for such crimes were seen as deeply disruptive to the harmony of the state. Interestingly, public shaming was also a tool. A corrupt official might be stripped of titles and recorded as dishonored, a fate that, in a society that prized legacy, could be worse than death. Many legal proceedings involved oaths sworn before the gods. A person might swear their testimony was true in the name of Amun or Osiris, believing that divine punishment awaited those who lied. Temples sometimes served as neutral ground for disputes, with priests acting as mediators. This not only reinforced the sacredness of the law, but also tied religion and justice together, ensuring that verdicts carried moral as well as legal weight. Every verdict was recorded, often in duplicate, one copy for local archives, one sent to the central administration. Over time, these records formed a body of precedent, allowing judges to consult earlier decisions in similar cases. A scribe might be tasked with retrieving an old scroll, its papyrus browned with age, but the ink still crisp. Reading aloud, he might recall a case from decades past, setting the tone for today's ruling. This system of careful documentation not only kept the courts consistent, but also ensured that the actions of officials could be reviewed if challenged. For the average Egyptian, the legal system was as much about preventing chaos as punishing wrongdoing. Knowing that disputes could be heard fairly and that verdicts would be enforced allowed people to focus on their work, their families, and their obligations to the state. For the state, justice was a way to keep the machinery of bureaucracy running smoothly. A farmer who trusted the courts was more likely to pay taxes willingly. A laborer who believed in mat was more likely to work diligently on state projects. In this way, justice was not an afterthought. It was a core function of governance. The Egyptian approach to justice, with its emphasis on fairness, restitution, and record-keeping, influenced later civilizations, including the Greeks and Romans. Even today, in modern legal systems, echoes of mat can be found in the idea that law should aim to restore balance, not simply to punish. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Egyptian bureaucracy, its understanding that stability is not achieved through force alone, but through systems that people trust to be fair. The courtroom empties. The judge leaves with measured steps. The scribe gathers his scrolls, and the disputing parties return to their lives. Outside, the sun is low over the Nile, and the city hums with its ordinary tasks. Grain being measured, boats unloading goods, temple bells ringing softly in the evening air. Justice, like the river, has flowed quietly, shaping the land without fanfare. Tomorrow, the bureaucracy will continue its endless work, recording, deciding, balancing, maintaining the harmony that has allowed Egypt to endure for centuries. The Nile has long since faded into darkness. The sounds of oars dipping into the water have stilled, and the hum of the marketplace has quieted. In the royal archives, the scribes have laid down their reed pens, the ink drying on the last papyrus of the day. But Egypt's bureaucracy, that intricate, tireless machine, was never only about the present moment. it was also about the future. Every record written, every verdict rendered, every grain measured and counted was part of a larger story, a story meant to outlive those who wrote it. In the quiet of the evening, as oil lamps flicker in the palace halls, the true weight of that work becomes clear. These were not just clerks and officials, they were keepers of a living memory. Egypt's administrators were not simply reacting to daily needs. They thought in terms of seasons, generations, and even centuries. The irrigation plans set in motion by one pharaoh might not bear their full results until his grandson sat on the throne. Taxes collected in a time of abundance were stored in granaries, not only for the year's lean months, but sometimes for years ahead, in case the Nile's flood failed. Laws recorded by one vizier could guide court rulings long after his death. This way of thinking, steady, patient, and always looking forward, is part of why Egypt's civilization endured for over 3,000 years. The bureaucracy did not depend solely on the brilliance of one ruler. It was a framework that could survive transitions of power, changes in leadership, even times of unrest. It is easy to imagine the bureaucracy as something faceless, scrolls, seals, and columns of numbers. But it was always human. A young apprentice scribe might have spent hours copying older records, learning the shapes of each hieratic sign, feeling the weight of history in the curl of a reed pen. A tax collector on a dusty road might have paused to share bread and beer with a farmer before noting down his grain dues. A judge might have taken extra time with a nervous defendant, knowing the verdict would shape the rest of their life. These small human choices, moments of patience, fairness, or care, were as much a part of Egypt's stability as the grand plans of pharaohs. When we read the papyri that survive today, inventories of cattle, maps of irrigation, canals, lists of temple offerings, we are not just seeing records, we are seeing connections. A grain delivery note from 1200 BCE might tell us not only what people ate, but how they traveled, how they stored food, how they trusted one another to keep their promises. A court transcript might reveal the rhythm of speech, the respect shown to elders, and the weight placed on truth in a society that believed the gods themselves listened to every word. In this way, the bureaucracy was a bridge, carrying not just goods and taxes, but values, customs, and ways of life forward into the future. We live in a world that often moves quickly, where decisions are made in hours and discarded in days. Ancient Egypt reminds us that stability sometimes comes from slowing down, from thinking not only about the next problem, but the next century. It also shows that bureaucracy, so often criticized in our time, can be more than red tape. At its best, it is a tool of fairness, memory, and order, a way to make sure that power serves the people as much as it serves the rulers. And perhaps most importantly, Egypt's system reminds us that even the grandest empires rest on countless small acts of record-keeping, measuring, mediating, and maintaining trust. Without those, the great monuments might never have been built, the floods never properly tamed, and the people never truly fed. Let us imagine one last scene. A boat drifts slowly on the Nile under a sky filled with stars. On board, a mid-ranking official returns home after weeks away on inspection duty. He carries scrolls in a leather satchel, records of taxes paid, disputes settled, and supplies moved. In the distance, the lights of his village flicker faintly on the shore. He knows that in the morning he will deliver these records to the local archive, and they will join thousands of others. He will not see the Pharaoh. He will not be remembered in the great temples. But his work, quiet, precise, uncelebrated, will play its part in keeping Egypt steady. As he rests his head against the side of the boat, the current carries him forward. The Nile flows on, as it always has, as it always will. In the stillness of that imagined night, the lesson of Egypt's bureaucracy becomes clear. Civilizations are not built only by kings and conquerors, but by those who keep the ledger's balance, the accounts, and ensure that the promises of one season are carried into the next. And in that, there is something deeply human, the same hope that our own work, in whatever form it takes, might endure beyond us, shaping a future we will never see.